What's important to realize when you talk about the infrastructure school, that it is about scientists being able to count on openly available platforms, tools, and services, as André stated before. But what are we then talking about? There are, when we talk about open infrastructure, there are already several initiatives that aim to support open practices along the research cycle. One of these is an EU-funded project that goes back to, I think, the mid of the previous decade, started then, and nowadays better known as OpenAIRE, where it actually is a mixture between a platform, a repository that contains lots of information regarding the research being conducted, both the outputs and practices. Thing is, of course, how can such publicly oriented infrastructures prevail over commercial ones? I know from being part of OpenAIRE project myself for a while is that such publicly oriented infrastructures suffer from, say, funding. So there is a certain need to continue funding without putting it into a situation where it has to go into, for example, creating licenses or subscriptions. And how can we actually deal with that? So that's a big challenge. But also avoiding the replication of the exact same models that are already there. Let's take, for example, if you compare commercial CRIS systems, research information systems, with a system like OpenAIRE, what can you do to make OpenAIRE having its own dynamics and to develop into a direction that is suited for the open science agenda rather than being limited by the constraints of any of these commercial alternatives. So if we talk about open science examples of infrastructure, we think about current research information systems to become better organized and giving more and more space for open science practices. Although not open yet, but eventually, hopefully, moving into the direction. But also systems like ORCID, as an example of unique publicly available identifiers of all kinds of outputs, but also DOI can be considered as well, so digital object identifiers as a persistent identifier of scholarly products. We think about a system like Cielo, which is a Brazilian platform for publishing scholarly outputs. We can think about an initiative of like arXiv that has been followed by many other initiatives regarding other scholarly domains where you can store your preprints. So we now have bioRxiv, medRxiv, SocArXiv, where scholars from different scholarly domains can store their preprints in such a way that they get accessible to by many other people around the science system. And then we have open reviews, which is indeed a next step into making science open. And of course, an important part, because that could also mean that doing reviews for your colleagues in an economy of exchange favors, you can actually use the review time as a kind of an indication of time spent in being a good open scientist.
Hello, my name is Stanley Faz. I'm a researcher at Utrecht University, and I'm been in the past 4 years an advocate for promoting more open science practices. So I would like to emphasize the importance of technology transfer at the university in the discussion on open science. Among all the discussions about open access publishing, data, software, and recognition and rewards, I have the feeling that this topic has been pushed to the side a little bit, especially with the emphasis on very urgent solutions that we need, for example, for the energy transition. I think that the discussion of open innovation, open hardware, and open source development for the energy transitions has also been discussed. So we have this implicit social contract at the time of peace, at least for the academia, that we are going to generate knowledge so that later the society can use it for the solutions to their needs. more recent models that one can practice which work with the open source development ecosystem. This is an example from the OpenNext project. It's an EU funded project and stays it actually closer to the heart of the research and the public value that the research creates. And it allows the researcher to stay involved and also use the fruits of their innovation as the innovation is happening with the private partners, but also inside the public environment, public ecosystem of innovation. This is one example for one company which also was based on open source model, and the technology of the 3D printer was turned into some pipetting machine. And when the need came during the pandemic, they could actually very quickly transfer this technology into something that the society needed a lot, and that was to develop tests for the virus, the PCR test. And the company could cover actually the whole need of New York City at the very peak of the COVID. Products can scale up very quickly within a matter of months their technology to provide testing for a lot of patients, reduce the amount of time needed for testing, and also reduce the cost for testing by a lot. And also economically, they also gained, and they gained a lot of funding to develop their business. This is just one example. There are many, many more examples of open hardware that are now completely compatible with economic development. I would like to emphasize the energy transition technologies and make a case that at least on this topic of energy transition, we really need to facilitate open innovation as a public institution. First and foremost, because there is huge urgency. And even the WHO in the peak of a pandemic says that actually climate change is a big health threat facing humanity. So very similar to the discussion of vaccines or drugs that cure pandemic, we also need to discuss the role of open innovation for energy transition technologies. There is a huge demand exceeding the supply. You can see that, for example, by growing gas prices, but also the need for storage of energy, which cannot be actually supplied by the current market production. There is at the moment also no unique winning solutions for many of these technologies. And this, another time, to avoid wasting resources and wasting time, especially by these companies, we need to allow these technologies to talk to each other so that the best technology comes up. Many of the suggested solutions are still immature, so actually they will benefit from opening up and sharing their blueprints or sharing their solutions. And also, like the case for the vaccines, for the coronavirus, the lion's share of the research and development is still public investment, and the benefit of it should also go back to the public. I have one example of how one can set up an open project from the basic to address one of the needs, and this is the FAIR battery project, which I've been involved in, with the goal of creating an open source electrochemical battery, deliberately using low cost and locally available material, because we would also like to look at the maintenance of these batteries and the long-term scale up of the batteries in the local communities, and also in parallel to developing such a solution, also set up education platforms necessary for maintaining these batteries in the long run. So I would be glad if more projects and more tech transfer offices take the challenge of supporting open hardware projects with and look into the new models of developing value for the society at the universities. Thank you for listening.
After listening to Sanlifa's story and everything else we've talked about, I think you realize now that we shouldn't consider infrastructure as just an afterthought of the whole discussion about open science. It is extremely important, like Andre already mentioned before, that during the pandemic it was comfortable that all these infrastructural conditions were already set to have data sharing, to have preprints going out, and new scientific knowledge being exchanged rapidly. So this is a clear example on the importance of infrastructure as a condition under which open science can flourish best. So, and again, you see here on two sides the different initiatives undertaken by the two agencies with respect to infrastructures. So they will be there for your convenience to be read and seen later.